All right, so now in this section, we're going to get to Jamestown, which is established April of 1607. You have some Englishmen that are trying to create the first permanent English settlement in the New World. And so they get on 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. They sail 40 miles up the James River, which is named after the English king, which is in present-day Virginia, and they settled on this place. It's an uninhabited peninsula. They selected that was upriver, out of sight of Spanish patrols. It offered easy defense around, ground assaults, and was uninhabited and located close to a lot of Indian villages and potentially lucrative trade networks. But you have to understand this. The location ultimately was a disaster. The natives had basically ignored the peninsula for 2 main reasons. And remember these 2 reasons. Terrible soil. It had terrible soil. And there was this brackish tidal water that would lead to debilitating diseases. But despite these setbacks, the English built Jamestown and made it the first permanent English colony in the present-day United States. The English had not entered into some wilderness area, right? They actually ended up right in the midst of what they called the Powhatan Confederacy. Powhatan, as he called himself, led nearly 10,000 Algonquian-speaking Indians in the Chesapeake area. These natives would burn acreage to clear the brush, create this sprawling artificial park-like grassland so they could hunt deer and elk and bison. They also raised corn and bean and squash and sunflowers, and they rotated the acreage throughout the Chesapeake. And they did this without plows or manure or animals. They just produced a remarkable number of calories cheaply and efficiently. And so Jamestown was a profit-seeking venture, right? It's backed by investors. The colonists were mostly gentlemen. They proved entirely unprepared for the challenges that laid ahead of them. They hoped for easy riches, but they didn't find any. One settler named John Smith later complained that they would rather starve than work. And so they did. Disease and starvation ravaged the colonists, thanks in part to the peninsula's unhealthy location and the fact that supplies from England arrived very sporadically, and when they did arrive, they were spoiled. Fewer than half of the original colonists survived even the first 9 months. Now, John Smith, he was a yeoman's son and a capable leader. He took command of the crippled colony and promised, he says, that he will not work, or he that does not work shall not eat. So he navigated the native diplomacy, claiming that he had captured and sentenced to death, but he claimed that he was captured, but that Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas had intervened to save his life. And she actually would go on to marry another colonist, John Rolfe, and Pocahontas goes to die in England, actually. So there's some truth to that story from Disney. Powhatan kept the English alive that first winter. The Powhatan had welcomed the English and placed a very high value on the metal axe heads and kettles and tools and guns, and they traded furs and abundant goods with them. But with about 10,000 Confederate natives and with food in abundance, the natives had little to fear and a whole lot to gain from the outpost of the sick and dying English, right? So the English just kept coming, though. They kept coming and coming, and they kept dying and dying. 400 settlers arrived in 1609, but the overwhelmed colony entered into a starving time during the winter of 1609 to 1610. Supplies get lost at sea, relations with the natives deteriorate, and the colonies kind of fight this really slow-burning guerrilla war with the Powhatan. Disaster is really right on the horizon for the colony, and the settlers ate everything they could. They roamed the woods for nuts and berries. They boiled leather. They dug up graves. They ate corpses of their former neighbors. One man was actually executed for killing and eating his wife. Some years later, George Percy recalled the colonists' desperation during these years when he served as the colony's president. He said, "Having fed upon our horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, rats, and mice, as to eat boots, shoes, or any other leather. And now famine began to look ghastly and pale in every face, and nothing was spared to maintain life and do those things which seem incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of grave and eat them. Now, archaeological excavations in 2012 exhumed the bones of a 14-year-old girl that had teeth marks on it. It exhibited that this is true. All 60 settlers would die by the summer of 1610. So all the ones that showed up, they're all dead by a year later. Very little improves over the next several years, but by 1616, 80% of all the English immigrants who had arrived in Jamestown had died. England's first American colony was really a catastrophe, and the colony was reorganized, and 1614, the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe really kind of eased the relations with the Powhatan, though the colony really kind of limped along as it was kind of starving and commercially disastrous. They weren't able to find any profitable commodities, and they remained dependent on the natives and sporadic shipments from England. But then tobacco saves Jamestown. Tobacco. You see, by the time King James I described tobacco as the noxious weed, loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs, it had already taken Europe by storm. By 1616, John Rolfe crossed tobacco strains from Trinidad and Guyana, planted Virginia's first tobacco crop. In 1617, the colony sent its first cargo of tobacco to England. The noxious weed, which is a native to the New World, fetched a very high price in Europe. And when the tobacco boom began in Virginia and later spread to Maryland, it was on. Within 15 years, American colonists were exporting over 500,000 pounds of tobacco per year, and within 40 years, they were exporting 15 million pounds a year. So tobacco really changed everything. It saved Virginia from ruining it. It incentivized other colonizations, and it laid the groundwork for what would become the United States. With new markets open, Virginia not only drew merchants and traders, but also settlers. So colonists came in droves. They were mostly young, mostly male, mostly indentured servants who had signed contracts that had bonded them to their employers for, a number of years in return for passage across the ocean. But even the rough terms of servitude were nothing. They were no match for the promise of land and potential profits that beckoned these English farmers over. But still, there wasn't enough of them. Tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop, and ambitious planters, seemingly limitless land before them, lacked only laborers to escalate their wealth and status. So, the colony starts this great labor vacuum, and they create something called the head-right policy. And it's something you might want to remember and write down, the head-right policy in 1618. Who basically said any person who migrated to Virginia would automatically receive 50 acres of land, and any immigrant whose passage they paid for would entitle them to 50 more acres. So if you went, you got 50. If you paid for somebody else to go, you got another 50. So in 1619, the Virginia Company establishes something called the House of Burgesses, which was a very limited representative body composed of white landowners that met for the first time in Jamestown. Also, in that same year, a Dutch slave ship sold 20 African slaves to the Virginia colonists. And in that act, Southern slavery in the United States was born. Now, the tobacco-growing colonists really expand beyond the bounds of Jamestown's kind of deadly peninsula. It becomes clear that the English were not just intent on maintaining a small trading post, but they wanted ever-expanding colonies. And so you end up with conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. And Powhatan dies in 1622. He gets succeeded by his brother, Openchacano, who proposed to drive the land-hungry colonists back into the sea. So he launched a surprise attack, and in a single day killed over 350 colonists, or about a third of the colonists in Virginia. They retaliate, and they revisited the massacres on native settlements many times over. The massacre frees the colonists to drive the natives off their land, and the governor of Virginia declares it colonial policy to achieve the expulsion of the savages to gain the free range of country. War, disease destroys the remnants of the Chesapeake Indians, and it also tilts the balance of power decisively towards the English. So the English colonizers brought back to the New World particular visions of racial and cultural and religious supremacy, despite starving in the shadow of the Powhatan Confederacy, the English colonists really judged themselves physically and spiritually and technologically superior to the natives in North America. Christianity, metallurgy, intensive agriculture, transatlantic navigation, and even wheat all magnified the English sense of superiority. And this sense of superiority, when coupled with outbreaks of violence, left the English really feeling entitled to the indigenous lands and resources. Now, the Spanish conquerors had established this framework for the Atlantic slave trade over a century before the first chained Africans came to Jamestown. Even, Bartolome de las Casas, celebrated for his pleas to save Native Americans from colonial butchery, for a time, he recommended that indigenous labor be replaced by importing Africans. Early English settlers from the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of North America mostly imitated European ideas of African inferiority, the idea of race, which followed the expansion of slavery across the Atlantic world. Skin color and race seemingly became fixed, and English equated Africans with kind of categorical blackness and blackness with sin, right? They said it's the handmaid and symbol of baseness. An English essayist in 1695 wrote that a Negro will always be a Negro, carry him to Greenland, feed him chalk, feed and manage him never so many ways. I mean, they believed that the slaves were inferior in every way. Some people looked to the Bible to kind of justify this, and they looked at the Old Testament and God's curse of Ham, who was the son of Noah, and they said, this is what dooms black people to perpetual enslavement, right? Which is ridiculous. But it's worth remembering for sure that the curse of Ham was kind of used as a justification for the enslavement of black people at the time. And yet, the early years of American slavery, the ideas of race weren't quite fixed as they would become, and slavery wasn't codified, and the first generations of Africans in English North America faced, terrible conditions. But in contrast to later American history, their initial servitude was not necessarily permanent or heritable, or even particularly disgraceful. Africans were definitely set apart as fundamentally different from their white counterparts and faced longer terms of service and harsher punishment. But like the indentured white servants, who were kind of whisked away from English slums, these first Africans in North America could also work for a set number of years, becoming free landowners themselves. The Angolan slave Anthony Johnson, for instance, was sold into servitude, but he fulfilled his indenture and becomes a prosperous tobacco planter himself that owned slaves. In 1622, the dawn of tobacco boom, Jamestown had really seemed like a failure. But when you get the rise of tobacco and the destruction of the Powhatan, it really turns the tide. The colonists are able to escape the peninsula, and immigrants begin to pour into the colony to grow tobacco and turn a profit for the crown. Now, the last section is going to be about what kind of people show up in this New England, and it's Puritans. So we'll pick that up next.